The double knock tactic is a really useful tool to use for managing our weeds, but there are two important things you need to remember. The first thing is that if we're looking at trying to control glyphosate resistant weeds and we're using glyphosate as the first knock, well, we need to take that into account. So therefore, the second knock with the other component, a paraquat product, needs to work a lot harder. So it's very useful to preventing getting glyphosate resistance, but it's not that necessarily a great tool to use when you have a paddock full of glyphosate resistant weeds, because you only rely on the second knock. So then you need to start looking at another strategy or another type of double knock. The double knock tactic means that it's two different weed control tactics we're using on the same flush of weeds. So the second knock could be a chemical or could be a non-chemical tactic like cultivation. Now, the role for cultivation as a second knock, well, I don't see it has a great role if you've used the first knock effectively. So one should have a few survivors. So why go out and cultivate your paddock for a few weeds? The only role I see cultivation in that situation, if you'll be able to actually strategically use cultivation in certain patches where you've got escapes and not cultivate the whole paddock, which would be unnecessary. With glyphosate resistance, often there is this perception that once we've lost the use of glyphosate by having glyphosate resistant weeds, magically there'll be another chemical there to take its place. But unfortunately that's not the case. Glyphosate is a great herbicide, and for the last 30 years there has not been another equal replacement. So we can't have that attitude, I'm going to use another type of glyphosate. We're using glyphosate because it works so well, it's robust, it's reliable, and the other products are not quite as reliable or robust. So when we need to use them instead of the glyphosate, we need to start improving our weed management skills and how we use these alternative herbicides. So if we think we have resistance, or we've had it tested and we've got some glyphosate resistant plants in our paddock, the critical thing is that you need to control seed set on those plants, so you're not building up a much larger population for next year. So you need to apply some sort of second knock on those survivors. And if you're aware that you've got survivors, and that means monitoring what happens with your first knock closely and soon after, so that you've got time to bring in that second knock as soon as possible after that first knock, probably within the first 1 to 2 weeks, because you want that second knock to work really effectively and stop those survivors growing to produce seed. Because each surviving plant, like barnyard grass or fleabane, can produce tens of thousands of seeds. So we want to stop that seed production and those seeds going into the soil and creating huge problems next year. My advice to growers is, with your paddocks, think what your paddock history has been with your herbicide usage. If you've been using glyphosate, relying on it for the last 10, 15, 20 years, you need to really carefully monitor what's happening in that paddock. I would go out after each time I've used glyphosate and carefully look to see if there are any escapes. And I think that's my number one suggestion, is to go out there and monitor closely. And if you are able to spot those few isolated plants that have escaped and stop seed set, then you're nipping that problem in the bud before it becomes a major problem across your whole paddock or farm. The timing of the double knock is very important, but it's not straightforward because it depends on A, what weed you're targeting, and B, what are the chemicals or the herbicides you're using in that double knock. But for a double knock that's using glyphosate as your first knock and paraquat as your second knock, the general rule is for summer grasses, you want the second knock to be about 5 to 7 days after the first knock. If you leave it longer than that, then the plant has got a chance to grow and it's becoming increasingly harder to kill with the second knock. If you're using a double knock that has a group A herbicide instead of glyphosate in the first knock, you can actually come in a little bit quicker than that. So it depends on how quickly you can get across your paddock and bring that second knock in. Again, you would not want to leave it longer than 2 weeks.